What in the world is that supposed to be? The voice, sharp and laced with the kind of arrogant confidence only a young man in a position of new authority can muster, cut through the shimmering heat of the Nevada desert. It was directed at the old man lying prone at firing position number 7. While the other 6 positions were occupied by young, eager airmen and Marines kitted out in the latest multicam patterns and operating rifles that looked like they belonged in a science fiction film, position 7 was an anomaly. The man was old, not just past his prime, but deeply, truly old. His face was a roadmap of deserts and jungles, canyons of wrinkles carved by sun and time. His hair, what was left of it, was a wisp of pure white under a faded, sweat-stained ball cap. He wore simple, durable jeans and a plain gray t-shirt, a stark contrast to the tactical gear surrounding him. But it was his equipment that had drawn the ire of Sergeant Kyle Cross. Sergeant Cross was the lead instructor for this advanced long-range marksmanship course at Creech Air Force Base. He was 28, built like a CrossFit champion, and carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed technology and peak physical fitness were the only metrics of a warrior. His own rifle was a marvel of modern engineering, a carbon fiber chassis, a high-powered variable optic with a built-in ballistic computer, and a suppressor that made its report a polite cough. The rifle at position 7 was an antique. It was an M21 sniper weapon system, a beautiful but ancient relic built on an M14 action. Its stock was a single piece of dark, oiled walnut, scarred and nicked with the memories of a dozen forgotten conflicts. The scope mounted on top was a simple, fixed-power optic with a plain crosshair reticle, the kind of thing you'd see in a museum. "I asked you a question, old-timer," Cross barked, striding over and planting his pristine desert boots a few inches from the old man's head. The other students, sensing a confrontation, subtly shifted their attention. "This is a Tier 1 qualification range. We're shooting at 1,200 meters. We don't have time for show and tell with your grandpappy's deer rifle." The old man didn't react for a long moment. His breathing was slow and even, a gentle tide in his chest. His left eye was closed, and his right was pressed firmly against the rubber eyepiece of the old scope. His gnarled, liver-spotted hands held the rifle with a familiarity that seemed less a grip and more an extension of his own bones. He seemed to be listening to something far away, carried on the desert wind. Finally, without moving his head, he spoke. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, like stones rolling in a slow river. "She'll do the job." The simplicity of the statement, delivered with absolute, unshakable calm, seemed to infuriate Cross even more. "She'll do the job? Sir, this isn't a VFW hall where you can tell war stories. This is an active military training exercise. That piece of wood and steel is a liability. The ballistics on a 308 out of that barrel will be all over the place in this wind. My computer is showing a 15 mil hold for a left to right at 10 miles per hour. What's your abacus telling you?" A few of the younger students snickered. They looked up to Cross. He was sharp, demanding, and knew every piece of gear inside and out. This old man was just a distraction, some civilian who had somehow gotten permission to be on their range. Probably a retired colonel or a visiting politician's relative. The old man finally pulled his head back from the scope. He rolled onto his side with a slow, deliberate movement that spoke of stiff joints but practiced economy. He blinked in the harsh sunlight, and for the first time, Cross saw his eyes. They were a pale, washed-out blue, yet they were startlingly clear. They seemed to take in everything: the mirage dancing on the range, the nervous posture of the students, the tiny bead of sweat on Cross's upper lip, without judgment or emotion. They were the eyes of a man who had seen the world and was no longer impressed by it. "Don't need a computer," the old man said, his voice still quiet. "The wind tells you. You just have to learn how to listen." Cross threw his hands up in theatrical exasperation. "Oh, listen to the wind. I get it. You're one of those old-school types. A real feel shooter. That's great. Wonderful. But that folksy wisdom doesn't put rounds on target in a combat zone, does it? Precision, sir. Mathematics. Technology. That's what keeps our people alive." He pointed a rigid finger at the M21. "That rifle is a museum piece. The barrel is probably shot out. The action is 50 years old. The ammunition you're using is probably surplus. You are wasting my time and the taxpayers' money. I need you to pack up your relic and clear the firing line." Now, the old man's placid expression didn't change. He simply looked at the distant steel target, a tiny white rectangle shimmering in the heat. It was a speck, an almost impossible target for the naked eye. Even through a powerful scope, it was a challenge. The range master said I was cleared to fire. He stated, not as an argument, but as a simple fact. Well, the range master isn't running this qualification. Cross snapped, his voice rising. I am, and I am revoking your clearance. Your presence here is a safety risk and a distraction to the men who are actually here to learn. From his position at Lane 5, a young airman named Miller watched the exchange with a growing sense of unease. Airman First Class Sam Miller was 20, fresh out of tech school, and this was his first advanced course. He was in awe of Sergeant Cross's technical knowledge, but his grandfather, a Vietnam vet, had taught him something about respecting his elders. The way Cross was speaking to the old man felt fundamentally wrong. It was disrespectful, a public humiliation that served no purpose other than to inflate the sergeant's own ego. He looked at the old man's rifle. It was old, sure, but it had a certain dignity to it. The walnut stock glowed with a deep, rich patina that only comes from decades of being held by human hands. It looked cared for, loved even. The old man, whose name Miller had seen on the sign-in sheet was Elias Thorne, began to slowly push himself up. The movement was pained, and he let out a small grunt as his knees protested. Cross watched with a smirk, arms crossed over his chest. Need a hand there, Pops? He mocked. Elias ignored him. He got to his feet, dusting off his jeans. He was taller than he looked lying down, maybe 6 feet, but his shoulders were stooped with age. He picked up a single, brass case cartridge from the small box beside his mat. He held it in his palm, rubbing his thumb over the pointed copper tip. This is a 175-grain Sierra Match King, Elias said, his voice soft but carrying in the sudden silence. Hand-loaded. Each charge weighed to 1/10 of a grain. The case is neck-turned and the primer pocket is uniformed. It's a good round. Cross scoffed. Congratulations, you have a hobby. That doesn't change the fact that you're not qualified to be here. Now, are you going to leave on your own? Or do I have to call the security forces and have you escorted off my range? The threat hung in the air, heavy and ugly. Having an old man, a civilian guest, forcibly removed by military police would be the ultimate humiliation. Miller felt his stomach clench. This had gone too far. Sergeant Cross was making a spectacle, trying to establish dominance, but he was just being a bully. Elias looked from Cross to the distant target, then back to Cross. A flicker of something, not sadness, not anger, but maybe a profound weariness, passed through his pale blue eyes. Son, he said, and the word was imbued with the weight of generations. There are things you know and things you don't. It's a fool who can't tell the difference. This was the final straw for Cross. The quiet, paternalistic rebuke from a man he considered an irrelevant fossil broke his composure. His face flushed a dark red. That's it, he snarled, reaching for the radio on his vest. You're done. He jabbed a finger at Elias. You don't get to talk to me like that. You are a guest on a military installation. I am a non-commissioned officer in the United States Armed Forces. You will show me respect. Respect is earned, Sergeant, Elias said, his voice still level. Not demanded. The tension on the range was now thick enough to taste. The other students were frozen, their high-tech rifles forgotten. They were witnessing a battle of wills, a clash of eras. On one side, youth, arrogance, and technology. On the other, age, humility, and a quiet, unyielding dignity. As Cross began to speak into his radio, Elias turned his back on him. It was the most dismissive gesture he could have made. He knelt down slowly, placed the single, perfect cartridge into the rifle's chamber, and with a practiced, fluid motion, slid the bolt forward. The metallic schlick-clack was the only sound in the desert. He settled back into his prone position, the walnut stock finding its familiar home in the hollow of his shoulder. He took a slow, deep breath, let half of it out, and his world narrowed to the circle of light in his scope. I'm warning you, old man, Cross yelled, his voice cracking with fury. You touch that trigger, and I'll have you in a federal prison. That is a direct order. But Elias wasn't listening to Sergeant Cross anymore. He was listening to the wind. He was listening to the whispers of a lifetime spent in the lonely places of the world, where the difference between life and death was measured in the beat of a single human heart. The heat mirage rising from the desert floor began to warp, the distant target blurring and reforming. The dry, sage-scented air of Nevada faded away, replaced by the thick, cloying humidity of a jungle 60,000 miles and 50 years away. The memory came unbidden, as it often did. He wasn't Elias Thorne, 73-year-old retiree. He was Sergeant Thorne, call sign, Whisper, age 22, lying in a nest of ferns and mud, the same M21 cradled in his arms. The stock was newer then, the bluing on the barrel darker, but it was the same rifle. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the oppressive silence of the Laotian border. He'd been in position for 3 days, living on water and raw nerve. His target was a high-value NVA general, a man responsible for coordinating attacks that had cost the lives of hundreds of American boys. The general was supposed to be at a command bunker 2 kilometers away, an impossible shot through triple canopy jungle. But Elias wasn't watching the bunker. He was watching a small, insignificant-looking stream 1,000 meters from his hide. For 3 days, he'd watched it. He'd listened, not with his ears, but with his entire being. He listened to the rhythm of the jungle, the chatter of monkeys, the flight of birds. And on the 3rd day, the rhythm changed. A subtle wrongness. The birds went silent. That's when he saw him. The general, overconfident and careless, so deep in his own territory, had come down to the stream to bathe, accompanied by only 2 guards. 1,000 meters. The air was thick as soup. A mosquito whined in Elias's ear, but he didn't move. He couldn't. He became part of the earth, his breathing shallow, his pulse slowing until it was barely perceptible. He didn't use a rangefinder or a wind meter. He used the drift of the mist rising from the water, the sway of a single orchid hanging from a branch. He held his breath, the crosshairs settling on a point in space just above the general's chest. He didn't aim at the man. He aimed at where the man was going to be when the bullet arrived a second and a half later. He pressed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder, the sound swallowed by the jungle's density. For a long second, nothing happened. Then, the general simply folded, collapsing into the water without a sound. The 2 guards stared in confusion before chaos erupted. But by then, Elias was already gone, melting back into the green labyrinth, leaving nothing behind but a single brass casing and a legend. He was a ghost, a whisper. He blinked. The jungle vanished. The oppressive humidity was replaced by the dry desert heat. The target at 1,200 meters swam back into focus. In front of him, Sergeant Cross was still yelling, his face contorted in rage. "This is Sergeant Cross at Range 4. I have a non-compliant civilian. Repeat, non-compliant. I need security forces to my position immediately." Airman Miller knew he had to do something. This was beyond a simple dressing down. This was abuse of authority. He couldn't challenge Cross directly. That would be career suicide. But he couldn't do nothing. He looked at Elias Thorne, so calm under fire, a man who seemed to inhabit a different reality, and a decision formed in his mind. While Cross was distracted with his radio, Miller quietly got up from his position. He walked back toward the supply tent, trying to look casual, as if he were just getting more water. Once he was out of Cross's line of sight, he pulled out his cell phone. His hands were shaking slightly. He was about to break the chain of command, a serious offense. But his gut, the part of him that his grandfather had always told him to trust, screamed that this was the right thing to do. He didn't know who to call. 911. The base commander? He scrolled through his contacts and stopped on a name, MSGT Davis. Master Sergeant Davis had been his instructor in basic training, a tough but fair man who had a reputation for cutting through red tape and solving problems. He took a deep breath and pressed the call button. "Davis," a gruff voice answered. "Master Sergeant, it's Airman Miller. Sam Miller. From your flight 2 years ago. Miller, I remember you. You're at Creech now, right? Don't you have NCOs there to bother?" "I'm busy." "Yes, Master Sergeant, I know. I'm sorry to bother you. But something is happening out here on the range, and it's not right." Miller's voice was low and urgent. He quickly explained the situation. The old man, the antique rifle, the belligerent instructor, the threat of calling the MPs on a civilian guest. Davis was silent for a moment. "So, a young buck sergeant is chewing out an old-timer. Miller, that's called life. It's not your problem. Let his chain of command handle it. But sir, Miller pressed, desperation creeping into his voice. You should see this guy. He's so calm. He's not rattled at all. And the way Sergeant Cross is treating him is just wrong. The old man's name is Elias Thorne. He signed in as a guest of the base commander. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The silence that followed was completely different. It was heavy, charged with sudden, intense focus. Miller, Davis said, his voice now dangerously quiet. Say that name again. Elias Thorne, sir. Spell it. Miller did. He could hear the frantic clicking of a keyboard in the background. Oh my God, Davis whispered. The sound was so faint Miller almost missed it. Oh, sweet mother of. Miller, what is your exact location? Miller gave him the range number and his position. Okay, son. Listen to me very, very carefully, Davis said, his voice now steel-hard and deadly serious. Do not hang up this phone. Do whatever you have to do to keep that sergeant from laying a hand on Mr. Thorne. Stall him. Argue with him. Get in his way. I don't care what it takes. Do you understand me, Airman? But Master Sergeant, he'll have my stripes for insubordination. Airman, Davis's voice was a thunderclap. If you let anything happen to that man, losing your stripes will be the least of your problems. The entire chain of command of this base will be a smoking crater by sunset. I am making a call right now. Just keep that old man safe. Can you do that for me? Why, yes, Master Sergeant. Good. Now go. The line went dead. Miller stood frozen for a second, his heart pounding. What had he just stumbled into? Who was Elias Thorne? He tucked his phone away and jogged back toward the firing line. Cross was off the radio now and was marching toward Elias with two other range safety officers. They were going to physically remove him. Miller's training screamed at him to stay out of it, to mind his own business. But Master Sergeant Davis's voice echoed in his head. Sergeant Cross, wait. Miller called out, his voice higher than he'd intended. Cross spun around, his eyes blazing. What is it, Airman? Did you need permission to use the latrine? Miller ran up, forcing himself to stand between Cross and Elias's prone form. Sir, with all due respect, maybe we should just let him take the shot. What's the harm? It's just one round. Cross stared at Miller as if he'd grown a second head. Are you questioning my authority, Airman? No, Sergeant. Not at all. It's just, he's an old man. It would mean a lot to him. We have time. It won't affect the qualification schedule. It was a weak argument, and he knew it. Get out of my way, Miller, or I'll have you up on charges so fast your head will spin. Cross hissed, shoving past him. He reached down and grabbed Elias's shoulder. All right, Grandpa, party's over. Let's go. The moment Cross's hand touched Elias's shoulder, something shifted. The old man's body, which had been relaxed and placid, went rigid. It was a subtle change, but profound. It was the change from dormant potential to imminent threat, like the coiling of a snake. And then another sound intruded. It started as a low thumping in the distance, a rhythmic beat that was out of place on the rifle range. It grew louder, faster. The unmistakable whump 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 of helicopter rotors. Two of them, and they were coming in fast. Everyone on the range looked up. Two sleek, black HH-60 Pave Hawks were bearing down on their position, flying low and aggressive. They weren't on any standard flight path. They were making a beeline for range 4. Cross let go of Elias's shoulder, his face a mask of confusion. What in the world is that? The helicopters didn't land. They swept over the range, kicking up a blinding storm of sand and dust, and came to a hover about 50 yards behind the firing line. Ropes snaked out of the open doors, and figures in full combat gear began to fast rope to the ground. Simultaneously, a cloud of dust on the horizon announced the arrival of a convoy of black SUVs, driving at high speed down the range access road, sirens blaring. The entire qualification exercise had come to a dead halt. The students were on their feet, staring in disbelief. This was not a drill. This was a full-blown rapid response deployment. The SUVs screeched to a halt near the hovering helicopters. Doors flew open, and more men, these ones in sharp suits with earpieces, fanned out, establishing a perimeter. Sergeant Cross looked completely bewildered. He thought they were for him, maybe a surprise inspection from a visiting dignitary. He straightened his uniform and puffed out his chest, ready to give a report. The rear door of the lead SUV opened. A man stepped out, and a collective gasp went through every service member present who recognized him. He was a tall, imposing figure with silver hair and the weary but resolute eyes of a man who carried immense responsibility. On the collar of his perfectly pressed uniform were 4 silver stars. It was General Mark Madsen, the commander of Air Combat Command, one of the most powerful men in the entire United States military. General Madsen ignored the swirling dust, his eyes scanning the firing line. He strode forward with a purpose that radiated absolute authority. Sergeant Cross, his jaw hanging open, snapped to attention and threw up the sharpest salute of his life. General, Sergeant Cross, range instructor. Unexpected pleasure, sir. If I had known you were visiting, I would have prepared a proper. General Madsen walked past him as if he were a piece of furniture. He didn't even glance at him. His eyes were locked on the old man who was now slowly getting to his feet, a look of mild annoyance on his weathered face as he brushed the dust from his jeans. The 4-star general marched directly to Elias Thorne, stopped 2 feet in front of him, and executed a salute so crisp, so perfect, so filled with profound and genuine respect that it seemed to make the air vibrate. Master Sergeant Thorne, General Madsen said, his voice booming across the now silent range. It is an honor, sir. I apologize for the intrusion. I came as soon as I heard. Elias looked at the general, then at the 2 helicopters, the dozen armed men, and the fleet of SUVs. He gave a small, weary sigh. You always did like to make an entrance, Mark, Elias said, his voice dry. He did not return the salute. He was a civilian. Instead, he extended a gnarled hand. The general took it in a firm, 2-handed grip, a look of something akin to worship in his eyes. You know I would have come myself to pick you up. You should have called. I just wanted to shoot, Mark. Not cause a fuss, Elias grumbled. Cross, who was still standing frozen in a salute to the general's back, finally lowered his arm. His mind was a maelstrom of confusion. Master Sergeant? This old civilian? What was happening? General Madsen finally turned his attention away from Elias, and his gaze fell upon Sergeant Cross. The warmth in the general's eyes instantly vanished, replaced by a glacial fury that was terrifying to behold. It was the kind of cold, controlled rage that ended careers. You, the general said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. Sergeant, what is your name? Sergeant Kyle Cross, sir, he stammered, his bravado utterly gone. Sergeant Cross, Madsen began, his voice deceptively calm. I have just flown from my headquarters at Langley, breaking every FAA regulation along the way. I have diverted 2 Pave Hawks from a critical training mission. I have deployed my personal security detail. I have done all this because an airman with more sense and courage than you will ever possess had to make a frantic phone call to a master sergeant who knew who to call to get to me. And do you know why I did all that, Sergeant? Cross could only shake his head, his face pale. I did it because you, in your infinite wisdom, decided to threaten, humiliate, and attempt to physically assault a living legend and a national treasure. Madsen took a step closer, his eyes boring into Cross. You stand there with your $5,000 rifle and your integrated ballistics computer, and you mock a man who has forgotten more about marksmanship than you will ever know. You preach about technology, but you have no understanding of the spirit of the warrior. You demanded respect from him. You demanded respect from him. The general laughed, a harsh, bitter sound with no humor in it. He turned to address the entire group of assembled students, his voice rising to a roar. Do you know who this is? Do any of you have any idea what this man has done for his country? He pointed at Elias, who looked deeply uncomfortable with the attention. This is retired Master Sergeant Elias Thorne. In certain circles, he was known by another name. The Whisper, he served 30 years in the United States Army, most of it in units that don't officially exist. He is one of the founding fathers of modern special operations snipercraft. He wrote the book. No, he is the book. Madsen began to pace, his words a hammer blow with every step. In Vietnam, armed with that exact rifle you called a relic, he recorded 197 confirmed kills. The real number is likely twice that. He executed a shot at over 1,100 yards in a monsoon, through the jungle canopy, to take out a target that was about to ambush an entire company of Marines. He held off a battalion of NVA for 2 days, alone, from a church tower, buying time for a village of civilians to escape. They called him the ghost of the Annamites because no one ever saw him. They only saw his results. He pointed at the M21 in Elias's hand. That piece of wood and steel? That rifle has more confirmed combat kills than any other single firearm in the U.S. military arsenal. It is a registered historical artifact. The Smithsonian has been trying to get it for 30 years. He refuses because he says she still has work to do. The students were staring at Elias with wide, disbelieving eyes. Airman Miller felt a thrill of vindication mixed with overwhelming awe. After Vietnam, the general continued, his voice resonating with history. He didn't stop. In the 80s, during the Cold War, he operated behind the Iron Curtain. We can't talk about what he did there, but I can tell you that 3 separate assassination plots against key NATO officials were thwarted by a single, untraceable bullet. He was the one who trained the first generation of Delta Force snipers. The techniques you learn, the formulas you use in your precious computers, he developed them. He wrote them in the dirt with a stick, testing them with live fire in the worst places on Earth. He stopped in front of a stunned Sergeant Cross again. In the first Gulf War, he was supposed to be retired, but he volunteered. They said he was too old. So he went in as a civilian advisor. On the second day of the ground war, a Scud missile launcher was preparing to fire a chemical warhead at a staging area full of American troops. An F-15E Strike Eagle that was supposed to take it out was shot down. There was no time, no assets in the area, except for a 50-year-old advisor with his old rifle over 2 kilometers away. The official report says the Scud had a catastrophic malfunction. What it doesn't say is that Master Sergeant Thorne made a shot from 2,430 meters, a mile and a half, in a sandstorm, and put a 308 round through the missile's guidance system. A collective, audible gasp swept through the students. A shot like that was not just difficult, it was considered impossible. A legend, a myth, and the man who had supposedly done it was standing right there. He has 3 medals of honor, Madsen said, his voice dropping slightly. All of them classified. He refused to accept them publicly because he said he was just doing his job. He has 7 Purple Hearts. He has been wounded by bullets, by shrapnel, by knives. He has survived helicopter crashes and being hunted by entire enemy battalions. He has saved more American lives than anyone in this generation will ever know. The general looked at Elias, and his expression softened again. 30 years ago, when I was a young captain pinned down in Mogadishu, my platoon was about to be overrun. We were out of ammo, with multiple casualties. All we could hear were the enemy closing in. Then, one by one, they started dropping. Silent shots from a ghost we couldn't see. For 2 hours, this man, from a rooftop a half-mile away, single-handedly held off over 100 enemy militia, allowing us to be extracted. He saved my life that day. He's the reason I am standing here. He turned back to Cross, and the fury returned tenfold. And you called him Grandpa, you tried to have him thrown off your range. Madsen's lip curled in disgust. You are not fit to carry this man's rifle case. You are a disgrace to the uniform and to the title of instructor. He turned to one of his aides. Major, I want this sergeant's instructor certification revoked, effective immediately. I want him reassigned to the most remote base in Alaska. He will be in charge of counting polar bears. And I want a full investigation into the command climate at this training wing that allowed an arrogant child like this to be put in a position of authority. Is that clear? Crystal clear, General. The major responded, already making notes on a tablet. Cross looked like he had been physically struck. His face was ashen, his body shaking. His career, his pride, everything he had built, had been vaporized in less than 5 minutes. The range was utterly silent, save for the whisper of the desert wind. General Madsen turned back to Elias. Elias, the range is yours. Please, forgive this embarrassing display. Elias looked at the devastated young sergeant. He saw not the arrogant instructor, but a broken boy who had been taught a brutal, public lesson. He shook his head slowly. He's just a kid, Mark, Elias said softly, full of noise and confidence. We were all like that once. He then looked directly at Cross, and his pale blue eyes held no malice, only a deep, profound pity. He just needed to learn. Without another word, Elias turned and walked back to his firing position. He knelt, settled into his prone position, and shouldered the old M21. The world went quiet again. There was no rage, no vindication, no ego. There was only the rifle, the target, and the space between. He ignored the 2 Pave Hawks hovering nearby. He ignored the 4-star general and his entourage. He ignored the stunned students and the humiliated sergeant. He let his breath out in a long, slow sigh. The crosshairs settled on the distant white rectangle. He didn't hold for wind. He didn't calculate for drop. He just knew. He was part of the rifle, and the rifle was part of the wind. He pressed the trigger. The M21 barked, a deep, resonant crack that was wholly different from the supersonic snap of the modern rifles. It was the voice of history. The recoil was a familiar, comforting push against his shoulder. The action cycled, ejecting the single, spent brass casing, which spun, glinting in the sun, before landing softly in the sand. For a long second, there was only the sound of the bullet's flight, a faint whisper on the edge of hearing. Then, from 1,200 meters away, came the clear, satisfying ping of a 175-grain bullet striking hardened steel. A perfect center mass shot. A cold-bore shot. The single most difficult shot for any marksman to make, and he had done it as if he were tossing a stone into a pond. A spontaneous cheer erupted from the students. It wasn't just for the shot, it was for the man, for the legend made real. Elias pushed himself up slowly and began to pack his gear. He broke down the old rifle with practiced, efficient movements, wrapping it in a simple canvas roll. General Madsen walked over. "Still got it, old man." "Never lost it," Elias replied, not looking up. Suddenly, a shadow fell over him. It was Sergeant Cross. His face was streaked with tears of shame. He stood trembling, unable to speak. Elias finished packing his rifle and stood up to face him. He looked at the young man, really looked at him, and offered a small, sad smile. "The rifle is a tool, son," Elias said, his voice gentle. "A good one is better than a bad one. But it's the heart and the eye of the man behind it that matters. You spent so much time polishing the tool, you forgot to sharpen the man." Cross finally found his voice, a choked whisper. I am so sorry, Master Sergeant. I had no idea. I was a fool." "Yes, you were," Elias agreed without heat. "But foolishness is curable. Arrogance is a choice. You have a chance now to learn the difference. Don't waste it." He patted the young man's shoulder, a gesture of forgiveness that was more devastating than any punishment. He then turned to General Madsen. "Thanks for the fireworks, Mark. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go get a lemonade. It's hot out here." He started walking toward the parking lot, a stooped old man in jeans and a t-shirt, carrying a canvas roll. The soldiers, from the lowest airman to the 4-star general, snapped to attention and held a salute as he passed. He didn't acknowledge them. He just kept walking, a quiet legend seeking a bit of shade. Months later, things at the Creech Advanced Marksmanship School were different. Sergeant Kyle Cross was not, in fact, sent to Alaska. At the personal request of Elias Thorne, his transfer was canceled. Instead, he was demoted to senior airman and assigned to permanent range maintenance duty. Every morning, he was the one who set up the targets, and every evening, he was the one who repaired them. But his duties also included one other thing. At the start of every new course, before any instruction on technology or equipment began, former Sergeant Cross was required to stand before the new students. In front of a newly installed plaque that read Range 4, dedicated to MSGT. Elias, the Whisper Thorne, he would tell a story. He would tell them about an old man with a wooden rifle, about his own arrogance and his own foolishness. He would tell them that the most advanced weapon system on the planet is the human mind and spirit. He taught them that respect is earned through quiet competence, not demanded through loud authority. He taught them humility. And sometimes, on quiet afternoons, the students would see an old man sitting in a lawn chair under a canvas awning near the range, sipping a lemonade. He never spoke, he never interfered. He just watched. And under the calm, steady gaze of his pale blue eyes, the young shooters learned to listen to the wind. They learned that the greatest stories of heroism are often a whisper, not a shout, and true strength is found in the silence between the heartbeats, just before you take the shot. These are the kinds of stories that build legends. And if you believe these tales of quiet strength and hidden greatness deserve to be told, consider sharing this one with someone who needs to hear it. Because in a world full of noise, it's the whispers that change everything.